What up, AP Worlders? Let's do this. The Industrial Revolution, probably, arguably, maybe the most important revolution in all of human history. Certainly, it was the tocsin of the modern age. So let's do this thing. So, what does industrialization actually mean? Well, the textbook gives a long and kind of stupid answer, but basically, it's the transformation from agrarian, meaning farming, economies to economies distinguished by industry and machined manufacture. Manufacture literally coming from the Latin manufacture, hand making. So working with our hands. And so we're talking about factory systems. And so we're also looking at the processes and technologies. So that means using factories, assembly lines, new technologies, in order to try to mass produce things, make things instead of farm for things. Now, it says an abundance of what resource allowed Great Britain to be the centerpiece and how was it extracted? We're actually going to jump around a little bit for this one. So, just kidding. The product was coal, right? Coal was an essential part of the early industrial revolution. Although England is such a small, tiny little country, it had 17 million people on it, and it was packed full of resources. And so, one of the big questions that always kind of comes up in history is why did Europe always seem to have these benefits? Why was Europe the place that industrialized and as a result took over things, right? I mean, the industrialization of England and Europe meant they had things like ships and eventually guns and machine guns, artillery, warships. It was this like thing that put Europe so far ahead. So why them? Well, one of the answers is right here. Resources, coal. Because England had coal, it allowed them to make heavy industrial items. So think about this. Before coal production, England had to use wood, and wood obviously comes from trees. And so England was in a crisis of deforesting their resources, which meant wood was really expensive and so not used often. But coal is dirt cheap, and it's refined into something called coke. And so coke, although kind of early on was not that great of an energy source, it became abundant, and it was the fuel of the blast furnaces for iron production. Okay, and so then it said, how was it extracted? We actually have to skip a little bit further to steam to get to that answer. And so steam was made useful by things like the steam engine. So Newcomen made the steam engine, and then it was James Watt who improved upon it. And so the steam engine was just that, right? So by heating up water, it would power turbine systems and generate energy. And that energy could then be used to fuel things like water pumps in coal mines, which allowed you to drain the water out of coal mines to harvest more coal so you could have more pumps. And so it was a self-supporting circuit. But other things began to run on steam engines like factories and their machines, and then long-term things like steamships and trains as well. Okay, so then shifting our focus to explaining how the Americas helped Europe and then the benefit that it gave them beyond that. And then we're going to start looking at what specific product drove all of this. So one of the major benefits that England will enjoy is the fact that it had colonies and empires. And so going all the way back to the original purpose of those colonies, it was to gain access to raw materials. So things like sugar and cotton, tobacco, but also things like timber and beef, cheap metal, right, were all collected in the colonies and then sent back to Europe as raw materials, where Europe could then manufacture and make them into more expensive goods and sell them for huge profits. Which then brings us to our next question. So what? I mean, what were the other benefits? That seems kind of self-explanatory. Well, colonies also meant that there were captive markets. And what I mean by that is, once England had made enough clothing for its 17 million people that lived on its island, it could then export manufactured goods like guns and furniture and clothing to the millions of people living in the Americas or in South Africa or India or Australia. And so in some ways, it wasn't just that they got cheap goods, they had also people who were stuck buying their expensive manufactured stuff as well. Okay, so what was the first product that drove all of this? Well, if you look over here on page 669, it has a whole long thing about cotton. So we've talked about in this class a ton about how silk was such an in-demand luxury good, and then calico. Clothing is always in demand, but cotton is a special one because cotton products are usually cheaper. Cotton is breathable and light, and so it becomes the cheap and comfortable working clothes of the common man. So, cheap cotton from places like the Americas and eventually Egypt and India would help give England very cheap cotton as a raw material that they could make into expensive clothing. And so look at all the technologies developed. So thanks to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, inventors made things like the flying shuttle, the mule, the power loom, eventually the water frame, the spinning jenny, the cotton gin, right? You name it. It was really the first targeted industry, and it was the biggest of those industries. And so by 1830, 40% of what England was exporting was a cotton based product, something in the textile industry. That's actually quite amazing when you think about it. Now, what role did iron and steel play in this process, and how did that impact other industries? And so we're looking now at questions 5 and then 6. So, iron. Iron was the cheap metal that started the Industrial Revolution. Early on in the 1700s, iron production is going to spike. That's a pun. Get it? A spike. Oh, God. Anyway, with things like cheap coal, coke, iron production became much cheaper, and so coal takes off. And I'm sorry, iron takes off. And so they can make cheap things like steam engines and machines and factories, the machining. And so all of that takes off. By the 1800s, though, a new process created by Henry Bessemer, known as the Bessemer process, allowed people to make steel, which is a superior product, is much more durable. And so it converts over to steel production in the 1800s. Now, all that iron and steel is used not just to make the steam engines and the water frames and the spinning jennies and the water looms and all of those things, but it also starts to make trains and rail. And so George Stephenson made the rocket, the first train that went 28 miles per hour. But eventually it will evolve past that. The first railroad is the Liverpool-Manchester line, and I bring that up because Liverpool always comes before Manchester. Again, I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. All seriousness. Trains were essential for the Industrial Revolution. If coal was going to be mined in the interior, it's very heavy. And so you only had two options. You could have like horses or humans, something pull a cart. Canals and barges were quite common, but it was hard to like keep building all these fake canals or connecting rivers. And so trains became a nice way of going from a mine and then moving that product to a mill or a factory where it could be refined into metal. And so they could mine the coal and the iron in places like Sheffield and Leeds, and then take it by train to a place like Manchester and convert it into metal, and then load it onto a train and take that metal to a place like Liverpool, where it was made into machine parts or trains or ships, because Liverpool was the big shipping capital of Europe at the time. And so all of these industries start to lock together thanks to these resources. And so trains also kind of lead us to steamships. And so shipping had been important for England because ships would sail around the island and across the empire. Now trains will go across the island to major ports like London and Liverpool, where they can load goods onto steamships that travel super fast as well. And so instead of taking like a month to get around Africa, a steamship can do it in just over a week. And so bringing back fresh produce like bananas, for example, meant that people in Europe had better diets. Politicians and armies and militaries could travel across the empire quicker to expand it or to put down revolutions. And so that really gave Europe this dominant edge over the rest of the world because they had resources and because they had colonies. Eventually, those things led to these industrial products, technologies that were unstoppable in the time. Okay, so now questions 7, 8, and 9 kind of go together. So let's try to go quickly here. So we're looking at some changes and continuities. The putting out system goes back to medieval farming and it stepped towards modernity. Most people farmed. They were poor farmers. They didn't earn money. So they really just kind of made their own clothes and they farmed for enough food to eat. But winter meant that, yikes, tough times. What do we do? And so families started to make either candles or clothing, little bits of money to supplement their income so they wouldn't die during winter. Well, that turned into proto-industrialization, cotton industry as we call, I'm sorry, cottage industries as we call it. And so people then started to like collect, or come together. So you might have 3, 4 families that would all work in one person's home or barn. And so they might actually have like a loom or a frame in this person's house. And so these women would be working in like a little tiny baby factory, not like making babies, but a small factory. Well, it couldn't keep up with demand. And so women wanted to make money and middle class merchants wanted to sell more clothing. And so factories were born. So in places like cities where you had a lot of people looking for work, factories were perfect. You could have a lot of low wage workers all in one central spot making these products that could be sold for profit. So, what would be some trends or continuities? Well, here's a continuity: labor. It's always labor intensive. Don't think that because it was the Industrial Revolution that all of a sudden robots did everything. It's simply not true. Machines were making work more efficient, but it still required human hands. Right? And so, just like in those early um, cottage industries or the putting out system where you might have a couple people making a few things, factories were just a lot of people making a lot of things. Right. And another continuity would actually be women. Right. As men were farming, it was left to the women to make the clothing often. And in the winter months, men would make candles or slaughter animals or improve the, you know, buildings on the farm. Women would be the ones making clothing. And so as these factories were put up, women were actually more desired as workers than men, partially because of their knowledge of textiles, but also because they were used to doing it. Oh, yeah. And you paid them way less. And that brings us to the last one, question 9. How did people's lives change? Well, other than exploitation of labor, like women working a ton and not making money, kids worked for even less and didn't go to school. And oftentimes, everyone worked in dangerous, hot, polluted, sometimes facing abuse and harsh working conditions, unsafe places. I mean, it was not good. But when you think about even the more broad change that was taking place in society, most people had lived in a life that had followed the seasons. As a farmer, winter was slow time and spring was planting. Summer was was irrigation and clearing land. And by the fall, you were harvesting. Now you just work all the damn time. And instead of getting up at sunrise or retiring at sunset, you woke up with a whistle or a clock or an alarm and you punched in at a boss's desk and you worked 8, 10, 12, 16-hour days. It all seemed rather unnatural and people didn't get paid much and it seemed harsh and kind of brutal. And so we even have protests, right? There were groups known as the Luddites, for example, who went around breaking machines and smashing technology to try to protect the innocence of man. Right. Other ways that our lives changed during this time period. So it was structure and it was unnatural. We came into urban centers, right? We started to centralize for the first time in human history. Over a majority, over 50%, now lived in an urban environment. Another major change is wage earning. Most people had been, remember, subsistent. Now people work to earn a wage, and that means that we buy what we need, and that makes us consumers. And consumerism is capitalism. That's the kind of economy that we have today. Started then because, again, people couldn't make what they needed, they had to buy it. And so that's where we get really the concepts of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, where he articulated just that, capitalism. He said that we are all greedy, selfish people who work for money and buy things that we want, But in doing so, we increase our standard of living and make money and get to vote, in essence, with our money to buy the things that we want. Now, in that process, two things happen. One, we need assembly lines, or what he called specialization of labor. And so people actually reduced their skills to only a couple things and became fast and efficient, but probably less knowledgeable or less skilled. Two, middle class people became extremely wealthy. When I call them middle class, I don't want you to think like struggling to get by. I'm talking like factory owning, bourgeois people, middle class. And when you think about the French Revolution, fighting for the middle class, and people like Napoleon passing reforms for the middle class, that's these factory owners, right? So they are classically liberal, meaning laissez-faire. They didn't want governments that would be all over them, like a king. And so they changed it to have freedom in their economy. They didn't want minimum wages or maximum hours worked or minimum age requirement or maximum age requirements. They wanted to be free and allow the market to speak for itself. If somebody wants to work for $1 a day, they should be able to work for $1 a day. But sadly, that meant exploitation of the masses. Your average person not only didn't make a lot of money, they couldn't vote. They probably didn't own a lot of property. And so life was pretty grim. And so these revolutions had made some gains, but not really enough gains for most people. And so the 1830s and 40s were full of revolutions, and most people didn't get the right to vote until like 1870s or 1880s. It was a pretty tough time. But more on that later, folks. The causes and technology of the Industrial Revolution.